On January 23rd, 2008, I went to church to do my cleaning. I went to the side door and put my key in, and the door felt loose. So I walked into the office, and as I get to the desk, this object on the floor catches my eye, and it was a woman, and I didn't recognize her. She was laying on her back, and she was in a pool of blood, and I screamed, and all I thought of was, is somebody else in the church yet? So I ran outside and I called 911.
911, where's the emergency? She's laying behind the desk. Blood. Listen, ma'am, listen for me. What part of the church is she in? Is she awake and able to talk to you? Yeah, look at her. She looks like she's dead. There's blood all over her head and around her head.
True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Mary Jane Fonder was a 65-year-old woman. She was living in Springfield Township, Pennsylvania, and she was known to be a bit of a loner, socially awkward, emotionally fragile, and very involved in her local church. But behind her reserved and harmless demeanor simmered a potent mix of envy and resentment, a hidden inner turmoil that would ultimately erupt into a shocking and tragic act of violence. So join us for Between the Pews, Faith, Envy, and Murder. In early 2008, a new face appeared at the church. Rhonda Smith, a 42-year-old woman looking for comfort and a supportive community after a difficult life. So this bright young woman quickly became a beloved member of the congregation, receiving support and attention from the pastor and from others. Attention that Mary Jane Fonder would grow to resent. So fascinating. Love this story, Dickie. What you got for a beer?
I got a beer from Weyerbacher Brewing Company, which is in Easton, Pennsylvania. This is an American Imperial Stout called 15. It's a 10.8% alcohol by volume, so be careful. In the snifter, it's a black-colored beer, really no head to it. A lot of these stouts really don't have foamy heads. It's got a smoky chocolate aroma.
Yeah, I still don't like smoke in my beer, but fair enough.
It's got a lovely taste. Chocolate, coffee. There's still that little hint of smoke. It's a very smooth and rich beer. I got a few we can have with our bar denizens down there. You ready?
I'm ready. I've had a rough day with 4 dogs, making my life hell, really. So I could use a beer. Don't even care how it tastes, really, but I bet it tastes pretty good because you have good taste.
You'll like this.
Okay, let's open it. I do enjoy the smell. Let me have a sip. Not bad, Dickie. I kind of enjoy it.
There you go.
Yeah. All right. Well, come on down and let me tell you a story.
Ready.
Okay. So Mary Jane Fonder, she led a troubled and isolated life that was marked by emotional instability and many difficulties socially. She was born back in 1942 in Philadelphia, where she experienced mental health issues from a young age, suffering a nervous breakdown at age 8. Can you imagine?
Yeah, what was that?
Well, it had to be a mental illness.
Nervous breakdown is just, to me, kind of a generic term.
It is, but have you ever heard of an 8-year-old? What do they have to be nervous about?
No, that's what I was saying.
So it had to be a dysfunctional household.
Something's going on.
Yeah, and then she attempted suicide at age 16, and when that happened, that led to a brief stay in a mental health facility. But Mary Jane Fonder continued to struggle. She struggled academically and socially, and eventually she dropped out of high school. Throughout her adult life, Mary Jane held many different low-level jobs, such as working in knitting factories and as a punch card operator at a publishing company. So she was never married, and she never had any significant romantic relationships. In fact, her social interactions would remain very limited throughout her entire life. So in 1987, Mary Jane returned to her family's home in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, to care for her aging parents. After her mother died in 1992 from some complications after having surgery, her dad, Edward Fonder, became very depressed. Understandable, they'd been married forever. But then he soon disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1993, so less than a year later. So his disappearance would cast suspicions on Mary Jane, who everyone knew did not get along with him. So when she reported her father missing, she told the police that she had heard the front door open while she was still lying in bed that morning, and she'd assumed her father had gone out to get the newspaper. She said she went back to sleep, and when she woke up around 11 a.m., she noticed that he was gone. So she then contacted the police, and they began searching for him with the help of many neighbors.
So this is something different for this guy. Just walking off, disappearing like that.
Yeah, totally. He had the adult daughter caring for him at home. Her brother wasn't living there at the time, but his wife had died. He was depressed, but still, where's he going to go? So it was very odd. It's not like he took anything with him either.
No, he just walked out the door.
Yes.
With the clothing on his back.
Well, that's what Mary Jane says, but we don't really know if that even happened. Mary Jane would later complain about her frustrations with the police investigation, saying they pressured her into hiring a lawyer, and this eventually led her to bar them from her property. She refused to take a lie detector test, and despite extensive searches with helicopters, bloodhounds, and volunteers, no trace of her father was ever found, and his case went cold. Even though Mary Jane was never charged, she remained a person of interest in the disappearance. So by the time Mary Jane met Rhonda Smith in 2008, she was already well known as a lonely and socially awkward person within the church community. Plus, people were suspicious of her. Something just wasn't right about her.
Yeah, it's like, but we're not calling you a suspect.
Well, they had no evidence.
No, they didn't.
They never found any trace of him.
That's very interesting. I'd be thinking that maybe somebody helped him disappear.
Well, and that's what the police thought, but they had no way of proving it. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Rhonda's background, because these two women interact, and this is where the problem occurs. So Rhonda was born 2 months premature, and she was born in 1966. After her mother Dorothy began hemorrhaging, her husband Jim rushed her to the hospital, and the doctor told them the umbilical cord was wrapped around the baby's neck and strangling her. So baby Rhonda would have to be delivered right away, or she would die. So the cesarean section went well, everything seemed fine, and Rhonda was born weighing 4 pounds 9 ounces. Not too bad for 2 months early, right?
No, that's a pretty good size.
Yeah. So Dorothy and Jim were relieved and happy with their daughter, but then the next day, Jim got a call from the hospital with some bad news. Rhonda was having heart and bowel problems, and she would need surgery to fix both. Now, before you ask, I don't know what kind of problems. It's a vague story from her father.
Yeah, well, I can make some guesses.
Okay.
She never had the surgery, right?
Nope.
Because the heart murmur disappeared.
So it was a heart murmur. Yeah, we do know that.
So it's not uncommon within a few hours of delivery for there still to be some blood circulation as if the baby was still attached to a placenta. So you can get some mild murmurs that just disappear as the baby starts acclimating to life out of the womb. And the same with the bowel problem. A lot of babies will have a fairly inactive gut, but with a little bit of time, it'll crank up. So and this baby did just that. She got to the tertiary hospital and did fine.
Yeah, she was rushed to the hospital the next morning, and Dorothy wasn't stable enough to go with her, so it was just Rhonda and her dad, Jim. And as the doctors loaded Rhonda and her incubator into the ambulance, Dorothy was beside herself crying. But during the trip with his baby daughter, Jim was very distressed too. He was just watching her to make sure she was still breathing. But when they arrived and they examined the baby, they did say she didn't need the surgery anymore. So no more heart murmur. And she'd had a bowel movement, so we knew that was working, right? Yep. So this was a time when Jim and Dorothy, very religious people, would look back on this as a miracle. So they believed they were safe from losing their precious daughter even as she grew up and had her own difficulties in life. And she did have her own mental health problems.
Yeah, she did. But she wasn't a sickly kid. She did fine physically. Just mentally, there's some difficulty.
Yep, her parents couldn't remember a time when she had to take headache medicine or really even had much of a cold. She grew like a weed, her mother liked to say, to the point that strangers asked her to reach for items on the top shelves when she'd go to the store. So she was 4 years old when the family first took her to Center Valley Farm, where Dorothy had grown up. And while some older children were afraid of the cows and other animals, Rhonda was fearless. Her nerves were strengthened, her mother would say, because she had 2 older brothers.
That could do it.
Yep, but Rhonda was also shy and reserved. She mostly kept to herself with her pet dogs and her guinea pigs, giving her the companionship she really wasn't getting from other children, other than her brothers. But even as she got older, she did have few friends, and she didn't have a boyfriend. But she was a good student, all A's and B's. Still not real involved in extracurricular activities. So without any real friends her age, her mother became Rhonda's best friend, and the two would hang out together like girlfriends. They'd go on shopping trips, do each other's makeup or hair, go ice skating, and cook meals together. Rhonda's mom would share her recipes with Rhonda. And Rhonda was such a smart girl, she caught right on. But Rhonda really started coming out of her shell in high school. She had new interests like horseback riding and acting in the school's theater department.
That says a lot. And here's this kid who's extremely shy, doesn't have any friends, and she gets to high school and she's acting in front of people.
I'm sure it was brave of her.
Very.
But from the age of 6, she wanted to be a teacher. And she spoke about it so often that her father used to joke that that was all she could ever talk about. In the years immediately after she graduated from high school in 1984, she worked several jobs, ranging from newspaper typist to customer service rep for a phone company. But then by 1986, she'd saved enough money to enroll in the community college, making her the first in her family to attend college. Then in 1988, Rhonda graduated from the community college with an associate's degree in secretarial science, and she moved on to Bloomsburg University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, which was about 2 hours northwest of her family home. But she continued to work throughout school, mostly as a cashier, and paid her student loans all by herself. So within 3 years, she was student teaching and on track to graduate in December 1991 with her teaching certificate in business education. But in the months leading up to her graduation date, it became obvious that something was wrong with Rhonda. So she was losing her appetite to the point that she was barely eating at all. Then insomnia was keeping her awake all night. And she started to develop strong feelings of paranoia, growing convinced that even her close friends couldn't be trusted. So between her college schedule and the irrationality of her thoughts, Rhonda realized that she might need to take a break and put her education on hold for a semester. But she couldn't. She told herself her teachers and colleagues would think less of her if she did that. So for Rhonda, failing to meet that December 15, 1991 graduation date would make her a failure. But then her mental condition only got worse. She reached what she later described as her total emotional breaking point. This was early one November morning during the 2-hour drive to Mansfield University to take her national teaching exam. So she was traveling on the highway and a car swerved into the opposite lane in front of her, and Rhonda was convinced she was about to crash. There was no collision, but Rhonda pulled over to the side of the road and broke down crying, believing for the first time that she would never be able to earn her teaching certification. She still forced herself to continue on to Mansfield, and she managed to pass the exam. But eventually, Rhonda's erratic behavior began to get attention. One of her friends knocked on the door of her apartment to check on her one evening, but Rhonda was convinced it was somebody trying to break into her apartment. Then another time, Rhonda called the police in tears, claiming somebody was trying to break in, but then when they arrived, there was nobody there. Rhonda also started to believe that there were hidden cameras in her apartment walls. So Rhonda was only a few weeks away from her graduation date, but now suddenly her dream of becoming a teacher seemed impossible. Jim told her to come home, but by now Rhonda was not even in a state where she could drive herself. So 2 of the university's psychiatrists convinced Rhonda to check into the Geisinger Medical Center, which was just 15 minutes away. So 2 days after Rhonda was first hospitalized, Jim and Dorothy came to see her. Her parents assumed she had suffered a nervous breakdown and that it was just the stress of college had been too much for her. It was only when they saw Rhonda for the first time that they realized the real severity of the problem. It was bad.
It seems to me. I'm wondering, with the paranoia, was schizophrenia the diagnosis?
No, she would be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She wasn't having any hallucinations, really. She was just paranoid. And a lot of it was because she wasn't sleeping during her highs.
Sure.
So Rhonda was barely able to speak or even acknowledge her parents when they came. And she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And what Rhonda had previously dismissed as mood swings, she found out were abrupt periods of mania and depression. So all of these symptoms for the past several months had been symptoms of bipolar disorder. Rhonda refused to believe the diagnosis at first, just as many people don't when they're first diagnosed with this disorder. When December 15th, 1991 came, Rhonda did graduate, but not with the teaching certification she'd wanted. Instead, her degree was in business administration, for which she had already earned the credits. So she had to be hospitalized several times over the next few years. On some days, like the day she visited the shooting range, she considered ending it all. But then as years passed, Rhonda worked hard to build a life for herself. Sometimes she would get really down on herself and regretful that she wasn't a teacher. She never lived more than 5 miles away from her parents because they were a real source of strength and support for her. But the Easter before Rhonda died, she wrote a 4-page letter to her father, thanking him for inspiring her and never giving up on her. She'd also written a poem for her mother, which ended with, "My mother is the best gift of all."
Hospitalizations were to adjust medications, try new meds, stuff like that.
Yeah, and get her stabilized so she could function. I mean, she really couldn't function in life.
No, I'm getting that.
Yeah.
I wonder, a lot of times with illnesses like this, the medication might help, but as it helps, then you don't want to take it.
Yeah, because sometimes they miss the mania, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes they can feel kind of flat from taking the medication. You hear it all the time, yeah. So, like most people, it just took her a while to realize she needed to take her medication.
In the winter of 2005, Rhonda and Dorothy first came to the Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church. They had gone to several other churches in the area, but she and her mother both liked this place right away, and they especially liked the music from the choir and the friendly new pastor who managed to keep his sermons funny and enjoyable while sharing his strong spiritual convictions.
Okay, so quick break here. If you're a fan of True Crime Brewery and really can't get enough of our storytelling and thoughtful analysis of crimes, subscribing at tiegrabber.com/subscribe may be the perfect next step for you. As a subscriber, you'll enjoy every episode without ads, and you can stay immersed in the chilling details without any interruptions. Plus, you'll get access to all of our exclusive bonus episodes that really dive into the most fascinating and disturbing crimes. So your support not only helps keep the beer chilled and the stories flowing, but it also allows us to continue delivering the content you love. Whether you're in it for the psychology, the mystery, or even the craft beer pairings, subscribing is a wonderful way to show your appreciation and to get even more of what makes True Crime Brewery so addictive. So if this sounds like something for you, just head on over to tiegrabber.com/subscribe and join the tiegrabber community today. You can also get the same benefits by going to our Patreon, which is patreon.com/tiegrabber. It was January 23rd, 2008, when Rhonda's friend Judy Zellner tried to unlock the side door of Bucks County's Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church. But the door was already unlocked, and it opened before she could turn the key. So she looked down at the doorknob, very surprised and a little annoyed. This door was always supposed to be locked, and she thought everyone in the church knew that. So the door to the church office was shut, but through a large interior window, Judy could see that the light was on. She hadn't expected anyone to be there. It was Wednesday afternoon. This was a day when she came on her twice-weekly schedule to do cleaning in the church. So she looked through the window, but nobody was sitting behind the desk inside the small office. Judy walked past the office, put her purse and coat on a table, and headed for the bathroom. So Judy had been attending Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church for the past 26 years. Even after she moved away to Allentown, she continued to attend this church. Judy's home in Allentown wasn't far, it was only 12 miles away, and she had to pass by several closer churches on her way, but never considered going somewhere else. Judy passed the church office again on her way back to the pastor's office, where she found his door was locked. Judy was again surprised. Since Pastor Gregory Shreves had joined the church almost 3 years ago, he was almost always there. Judy took her cleaning supplies from the closet down the hall, and she went back downstairs to the church office. So nobody was behind the desk, and she started walking toward the file cabinets in the corner. But as she passed the corner of the desk, she just froze in her tracks because something was out of place, something caught her eye. Crumpled on the floor behind the desk was the body of a woman. Her legs were folded at the knees, and her head and upper body were curled forward. And there was a huge amount of blood. The woman's head was soaked and lying in the dark red puddle, strands of her long brown hair splayed out in all directions. Judy looked at the woman's chest and saw no movement. Then she noticed the wound on the right side of the woman's head. So she realized now that the person who did this could still be in the church. So Judy grabbed the cordless phone that was sitting on the desk and ran outside to call 911. Once the operator answered, Judy screamed into the phone. The operator tried to calm her down and instructed her to stop screaming. "There's a girl murdered in our office," Judy said, and her voice was very loud and hysterical. "She's lying behind the desk, full of blood," Judy said. Her voice was growing higher, and her breathing was very fast and shallow. So 2 paramedics with Upper Bucks Regional Emergency Medical Services got this call, and they rushed out to their ambulance. The church was just a 1/10 of a mile up the road, and when they arrived, Judy was standing there waving at the bottom of a small stairway leading up to the side door of the church. So the paramedics stepped inside with Judy. She pointed toward the office and explained, "She's behind the desk." So, as a paramedic stepped further into the office, he saw the woman on the floor, but he could hear that she was still breathing. But she was gurgling, choking on her own blood. It was clear that the woman had been shot, and most of the blood had come from the right side of her head, and there was a bullet wound just above her ear. She had a pulse, but she was non-responsive. On the floor there was a shiny piece of metal that appeared to be a bullet fragment, but there were no weapons there. So after outlining the body on the floor, the paramedics lifted the woman and put her onto the backboard. And as they lifted her, her head turned a bit, and Judy was just shocked to see that the victim was her good friend Rhonda Smith. So after the police arrived, Judy explained to them what had happened. She described arriving at the church, going to the pastor's office, finding the body in the downstairs office, and she told them it's Rhonda Smith, a 42-year-old woman who'd been coming to the church with her mother for a couple of years now. The office was on the bottom floor of a modern 2-story section of the church. The 12 by 12-foot room was filled with office equipment, and that included filing cabinets, a copy machine, and a tall stack of mailboxes for the church officers. Several laptop computers were found there, but whoever shot Rhonda hadn't bothered to take them, hadn't taken anything.
Yeah, so it wasn't a robbery.
Absolutely not. It was an execution.
Yeah, Rhonda's.
Yes. So Rhonda was taken to a larger hospital which had a trauma unit, and meanwhile her parents, Jim and Dorothy, looked at the answering machine as they entered their home. They were surprised to see no messages waiting for them from their daughter. Rhonda should have called them by now. So the couple had seen their daughter's green car in the parking lot of the church as they passed on their way to nearby Quakertown for lunch that day. They had thought it was strange that her car was still there at 12:30 p.m. since she was scheduled to work from 9 a.m. to noon. It was Rhonda's third day working mornings, filling in as the church secretary, while Pastor Shreves was away at a convention. So it was kind of the pastor to give their daughter a little work, they thought. Her bipolar disorder, which Rhonda had struggled with since her early 20s, really made finding and keeping a job quite difficult for her. So the couple had taken a different route back from the restaurant in Quakertown, so they hadn't passed the church again on their way home. But they couldn't imagine that Rhonda would still be working anyway. Jim picked up the phone and called Rhonda at home, but he got no answer. A little while later, the phone rang. He picked up the phone, expecting to hear his daughter's voice, but was surprised to hear the voice of a different woman who identified herself as a social worker from St. Luke's Hospital. So the woman told them that their daughter had been hurt, that there was an accident down at the church. Jim asked, well, what did she do, fall and break something? But he was absolutely stunned when the woman said, no, she's been shot. So she went on to say that Rhonda was not expected to live. So Jim and Dorothy, of course, rushed to the hospital, and they were hoping that another miracle might happen for them.
Now, how would you like to be that parent? You go out for a little lunch, come home, you're expecting to see your daughter. They can't get a hold of her. And you get a call from the person at a hospital saying that she's been shot.
Well, it's every parent's nightmare, of course. So Judy sat in her van outside of the church with her husband. She had met Rhonda at the church 2 years ago, and it was her habit to go up and say hello to all new visitors. Then she and Rhonda got along right from the beginning. So despite the almost 20 years between them, Judy was 60 and Rhonda was 42, they started to get together outside of church, having lunch or just hanging out at Judy's house. So from the beginning, Judy felt that Rhonda really needed a friend, and she'd wanted to be there for her. Judy herself had already been through a lot in her life. She'd been in therapy and on Prozac since 1992, after she found her mother dead in her apartment. Judy had gone over one day to have lunch, but there was no answer at her mother's door. The coroner determined that she had died from a heart arrhythmia. But this was a memory that really haunted Judy, and this was along with the tragic death of her 20-year-old son, Ricky, which happened in 2001. Ricky had put lit candles on the back deck when his friends were over, and he left them burning after his friends left. So while Ricky slept in the house alone, the candles started a fire, engulfing the wooden deck and the cedar-sided house very quickly. The police told Judy not to look at Ricky's body as they carried it from the house, but she just couldn't help it. She wanted to see her son. So she'd lost her mother and her son, both very quickly and tragically, really. And now her friend Rhonda.
That's a lot.
It is a whole lot to deal with. So the police interviewed Judy. She's the one that found the body. And she explained that several parishioners had keys to the church, and she had one because she was the sexton. Although it was unusual for the church door to be unlocked, she told the troopers she wasn't surprised to see the office light on. Pastor Shreves often left the light on after he left. Then she said there was a green car in the parking lot, but she hadn't recognized it and thought it may have belonged to the new church secretary. Then she described finding Rhonda dying on the floor in a large pool of blood. After her call to 911, Judy recalled how she screamed at cars as they passed by the church, but no one would stop to help her. And when the ambulance arrived, she led the paramedics into the office, and that's when she realized it was her friend Rhonda who had been shot. So Rhonda had been a member of the church for 2 years, Judy told the troopers, and her mother was also a member. Rhonda and Judy sang in the choir together. She knew about Rhonda's mental health issues and described how Rhonda would sometimes call Judy when she was depressed. Judy took Rhonda's calls at any hour of the day. During one of her calls, Rhonda told Judy she was on her way home from a shooting range where she had thought about killing herself. That time they talked for about an hour, and Judy thought she had cheered her up, but the next day she learned that Rhonda had been hospitalized. So there would be days and weeks when Rhonda was fine, but then every couple of months she would fall into a deep depression. Rhonda had had a boyfriend named Ray, Judy said, but they'd broken up about 2 weeks ago. It was a mutual breakup, she said, and Rhonda did seem okay with it. Ray lived about 1 hour south, and he had taken Rhonda to the movies and dinner several times. But Judy really didn't know a lot about this guy. She didn't know of any enemies or people who would have wanted to hurt Rhonda either. She didn't know why Rhonda was at the church and could only assume that Pastor Shreves had asked her to assist with some secretarial duties. Nothing appeared to be missing from the church, and not much money was kept around anyway. The Sunday collections were deposited into the bank each week. So while this is going on, this is the third and final day of Pastor Shreves' conference in Malvern, Pennsylvania. It was a requirement for all new pastors. So for 3 days every year, all the new pastors in the Lutheran Theology Seminary would get together to talk about their successes and their challenges, attend presentations, and, just kind of talk to each other. These conferences made sense for the 20-something new pastors, he thought, but for second career types like Shreves, it felt like the kind of thing that he had already outgrown. But this was the last year he had to attend this conference, and he'd be happy to leave it behind. Just a few years ago, Shreves never would have expected to be surrounded by pastors in training and learning how to be a man of God, because 10 years ago, he was a golf pro working out of Philadelphia as Director of Section Affairs for the Professional Golf Association. So now he was 56 years old, although he still looked more like a pro golfer than a pastor. He was athletic, over 6 feet tall, with a touch of blonde left in his graying hair. He had very bright blue eyes that made him very attractive to women.
That's an interesting career switch, I think.
Isn't it?
A professional golfer decides to become a minister.
Yep.
Huh.
Interesting. Well, Shreves had really loved golf back to when he was like 11 years old, and that's when he borrowed a set of clubs that his father had received as a Christmas gift. So Shreves would hit balls out of his backyard and found out he had a gift for the sport. So by age 13, he was traveling all over the country to play. As an older teen, he was the runner-up in the USGA Junior Amateur Golf Championship.
So he was not just a pro golfer, he was a good golfer.
A very good golfer.
Amateur golf championship, it's quite a feat.
Yeah, I think that he expected his life to be that of a pro golfer.
Yeah.
It's very competitive.
Oh, it is.
So around 1999, Shreves started to feel a pull toward a life of ministry. It started when one of his friends had noticed that he had gifts that Shreves hadn't seen in himself. Shreves always treated people with respect and compassion, the friend said, and these were traits that would serve him well in the job as pastor. So Shreves joined the Lutheran Theology Seminary in Philadelphia in January 2002, and he graduated in the spring of 2005. So he finished in 2.5 years instead of the normal 4. But he liked to say this didn't happen because he was smart, just because he worked really hard at it. He took classes in the summer and during his internships, and by March 2005, he interviewed for the job of pastor at the Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church. Many of the congregants were descendants of the families that were buried in the graveyard behind the church. So this was the kind of place where even if you'd been there for 15 years, there were probably still some people who would consider you a newcomer. So immediately upon seeing the place, Shreves could tell that the church was a perfect fit for him, and the church council really felt the same way. Shreves wanted to find a place he could call home for a really long time, which is exactly what the congregation was looking for in their new pastor. The church had been without a full-time pastor for about 2 years at that point, and Shreves was just what they were looking for. He was energetic, outgoing, and he would really reach out to the community and try and engage his congregation. So now, 3 years later, he was in the room he'd been staying in during the conference when someone knocked on his door. He was told he had a call from Jim Nilsson, a past council president from Trinity Evangelical. So Nilsson told the pastor that the state police wanted to talk to him, and a few minutes later, an officer called him. As Shreves listened to the news about Rhonda, he just felt sick. He realized then that the quiet life he'd envisioned for his small parish was forever changed by this horrible crime. So police cars were parked around the church parking lot all day, but troopers had concluded the first part of their investigation and found nobody inside and no gun. Police dogs were going to be brought in for a more thorough search, and the forensic investigators still had many hours of work ahead of them. Now, the Springfield Elementary School, which was just half a mile away, was in lockdown mode in response to this shooting, and they would actually remain in lockdown for the next several days because this wasn't solved right away.
No, well, it's not like you got the perpetrator standing there with a gun saying, I did it.
No, and some people were thinking it may have been a suicide by Rhonda, which confuses me because there was no gun found.
There was no weapon found, and she had been shot twice.
Right.
Which I guess you could do that.
Well, if you kind of miss with the first one, sure.
Yeah.
But another thing they would bring up is maybe someone covered up for her because she was religious and tried to hide the fact. If they didn't want the police to think it was a suicide, they would take the gun. But that just seems like a real long shot to me. All right, so Judy Zellner and her husband Les drove straight to St. Luke's Hospital as soon as the police let them leave the church. Rhonda's poor parents were waiting in a small room with Pastor Shreves, who had just returned from Melbourne. After a few minutes, the doctor came out and gave them the news that they'd been dreading. Rhonda was brain dead, he said. The doctors were keeping her on life support for the possibility the family might consider donating some of her organs. So Jim and Dorothy thought, well, this might be some way to honor her. At least she can live on in this way. And they started filling out the organ donation paperwork. But then they were told that they wouldn't be permitted to donate Rhonda's organs because her body needed to remain intact for an autopsy the next day. So that was kind of disappointing.
Yeah, I never given that much thought. Yeah. Can't be an organ donor if you're going to have an autopsy done.
Exactly. Other close family members, Judy, Les, and Pastor Shreves, all went into Rhonda's room. Her head was wrapped in bandages and her right eye was red and swollen. So this was not the Rhonda they'd all known and loved. But they stood in a circle around her bed and said a prayer. That was their way of saying goodbye to Rhonda, and it was heartbreaking.
I'm sure it was.
So the sweet young woman. So Shreves agreed to be interviewed, and 2 investigators began asking him about his history with the church and his involvement with Rhonda. So the pastor really hadn't known Rhonda that well. He couldn't remember when she first came to the church, but he said Rhonda had come to him for counseling and advice 2 or 3 times. She had told him about a past relationship she'd been in that was abusive and had ended with Rhonda having an abortion. Then there had been a more recent boyfriend, the pastor said, a man from Northeast Philadelphia who Rhonda had met on the internet. But the relationship had ended when he no longer wanted to continue a long-distance relationship. So Rhonda had also mentioned that she was dating a married man, but she had never revealed his identity. The troopers noticed that Shreves seemed a bit nervous. He was stuttering and his eyes were darting back and forth. This was a difficult situation, and he did seem like a nice guy who was just doing his part to help Rhonda during difficult times. But at this point, they couldn't rule out anyone as a suspect.
Right. Of course, a guy who is acting nervous and maybe guilty of something, they'd pay more attention to.
Yeah, and it was at his church.
Right.
So 45-year-old second-grade teacher Steve Wysocki was still working at the elementary school when he got the news. So he'd worked for the school district for 25 years and had been Trinity Evangelical's choir director and organist for about 12 years. So the weekly choir practice was scheduled for later that day, and Steve had planned to go straight over to the church and start getting ready once his workday was over. But then his wife called him and told him about the shooting and that Rhonda had died. The news, of course, upset Steve because he just couldn't believe that something like this could happen in his own church. Under the circumstances, though, there was no way that choir practice would continue. So Steve and his wife Debbie spent the next hour between 5 and 6 o'clock calling each of the choir members to tell them the news. And everyone he called was just horrified. Some church members already knew that something had happened, but they hadn't been sure exactly what or to whom. Some falsely thought it was the new secretary, Megan, who'd been shot. But then by the evening, word of what really happened was starting to reach most of the congregation. So with his calls nearly complete, Steve dialed the number of Mary Jane Fonder, who at 65 years old was a longtime church member. So Steve had saved her for last, and that's in part because Debbie had told him that Mary Jane called the week before and left a message saying she was quitting the choir. So something had made Mary Jane upset, Debbie told him, but it was unclear if it was related to the church or to something else. So Steve hoped to talk to her about that and find out what was on her mind. And the other reason he saved Mary Jane for last was because Mary Jane was a talker. She had a reputation with other church members as being quite the oddball, and she was well known for her tendency to ramble on, and once you got into a conversation with her, you could get kind of stuck. We've all known someone like that. But it seems like she was just kind of wacky, the things she said as well.
Yeah.
So when Mary Jane answered, Steve explained that Rhonda had been found shot inside the church and that she had not survived. But Mary Jane seemed neither shocked or really all that fazed by the news. Rather than even acknowledging it, she started talking about the things she'd been doing that day, which included a trip to the hairdresser and some shopping. Mary Jane, Steve said, "Did you hear what I said? There's been a shooting." Mary Jane just continued talking, but again did not acknowledge what was said to her. So Steve wondered, what's going on? Is she in shock? Then after listening politely for a few minutes as Mary Jane continued to talk about nonsense, Steve finally interrupted and said, "Well, please pray for Rhonda, okay?" And said goodbye, and Mary Jane said goodbye, and they hung up.
Not the response that Steve was expecting.
No, not at all. There were 3 men of interest to the police that day as they investigated Rhonda's death. They were the man she had recently broken up with, the guy she was supposed to see that night, and the man she had been in an abusive relationship with. So troopers interviewed Gregory Denisovich, the local man Rhonda had a date with for that evening. They found him at his house in Coopersburg, a small town about 10 minutes from the church. So he was supposed to pick up Rhonda at her apartment at 6 o'clock that evening, but after getting no response from knocking on her door, he'd waited a few minutes and then just gone back home. So now it was 7:50 p.m., and Denisovich said he was worried that he hadn't heard from Rhonda and had planned to call her later that night. So these two had met at a Lehigh Valley Hospital bipolar support group 3 months earlier. They'd gotten together outside of the group as friends maybe 5 or 10 times, and he said he would try and make her feel better by taking her out. Rhonda had told him she had been suicidal in the past, and Rhonda was still upset over the abortion she'd had years ago, he said. Recently, she'd been dating a man named Ray, who she'd met on Match.com, but he said that Ray stopped calling her about a month ago, and Rhonda was upset about it, but she believed Ray had only wanted sex from her anyway. Now, as for him, he and Rhonda had talked last on Monday when he called to reschedule a dinner date. She seemed in good spirits when they talked. He told the troopers he was home the entire day taking care of his mother, who was recovering from surgery. And the only time he left the house was to get pizza for his mother around 5 p.m. And his mother did confirm his alibi. So while this is going on, 2 more state troopers were en route to Philadelphia to talk to Ray Finkel, and this was Rhonda's most recent ex-boyfriend. So it turned out not to be an easy task. When the troopers arrived at the address listed on his driver's license, they learned he no longer lived there. Finkel wasn't at the next apartment in Northeast Philadelphia, that the troopers had been referred to either, but then with the help of the Philadelphia police, Finkel was found at his parents' house. So he agreed to answer the troopers' questions and went willingly to the police station. Finkel said he took a 6:11 a.m. train to go where he worked as a financial analyst. He was there all day with his boss and another co-worker, except for a noontime meeting and then lunch at 1:30 p.m. The times could be verified with his building's swipe card system, he said, that clocked him in and out of the building. So when told that they were asking about Rhonda Smith, Finkel replied that she was a friend that he had met on the dating site plentyoffish.com. They met online on the second weekend of October and had their first date the following Friday. The two had last gotten together the second weekend in November, he said. He'd broken off the relationship because of the distance, and she seemed to understand. So when the troopers told Finkel about Rhonda's death, he seemed appropriately surprised, and he was visibly upset. Police later did determine that his timeline checked out, too. So he couldn't have been in Springfield Township when Rhonda was killed. Then they went and spoke to Steve and Carol Hannes, who were Rhonda's landlords. And they said that Rhonda said she was thinking of dating a married man, but she never mentioned a name. Carol had advised Rhonda against this because she'd still be alone and there was nothing to gain from the situation. Steve and Carol Hannes had become close with Rhonda during the time she rented an apartment from them, and they really considered her like one of the family. She said she was a sweet kid and you couldn't be mad at her, so why would anyone possibly want to hurt her? So the police learned more about Rhonda's former emotionally abusive relationship from the director at Turning Point of Lehigh Valley. So that was a domestic violence assistance organization. Rhonda had come to that group in 2005 for regular counseling about her boyfriend at that time. The state police would learn more about him from Rhonda's own writing. As part of her therapy, Rhonda had written about a time in March 2004 when he had had sex with her without her consent. So Rhonda was very upset by this experience, even more so when she found out that she was pregnant.
So it seems to me that it was more than an emotionally abusive relationship.
Yeah, good point.
If she was having sex against her will.
Yeah, horrible, huh?
Yes.
But she was on lithium for bipolar disorder and she decided to have an abortion. But that would bother her for the rest of her life.
I'm sure.
She's very religious. So in 2006, Rhonda reported the incident to the police, who forwarded the case to the DA's office. Police reports didn't say why Rhonda had waited 2 years to report the crime, and the office declined to prosecute because proving it would be too difficult. So a check of the church's phone records led police to investigate Rhonda's past suicidal threats. The record showed a call had been made to the Northampton County Crisis Center the day Rhonda had died. The call had lasted 1 minute and 8 seconds. Trooper Raymond Judge was assigned to find out more about Rhonda's call to the crisis center. So Rhonda had called the center 4 times in the week before she died. The first had been January 18th when she called crying uncontrollably, saying she hadn't been sleeping and felt like a failure. Rhonda called the center 2 days later, again crying and saying she couldn't get out of bed. A caseworker visited Rhonda that afternoon and suggested she sign up for an intensive care manager. So this would mean that a counselor would meet with her on a regular basis. Rhonda did seem interested in that, but 2 days later, she called the center again, reporting that she was feeling very anxious. So that was the day before she died. And that brought police to the phone call Rhonda had made to the crisis center the day she died. It turned out she had called to tell a caseworker that she was feeling better, but he wasn't due in until the afternoon, so Rhonda said she'd call back later. But several days passed and the police had no real suspect in Rhonda's murder. They went back to Pastor Shreves again to see if something new might pop up. And after some prodding, Shreves told them about a church member named Mary Jane Fonder, who he believed was infatuated with him. So Mary Jane had been calling his house 3 or 4 times a week and leaving disturbing messages. She would call and say her spirits weren't right and things like that. Though Shreves put a block on Mary Jane's phone number, she still managed to get through to his number, maybe using a cell phone instead. Also, Mary Jane had entered his house once when he wasn't home and put food in his refrigerator. So Shreves had confronted Mary Jane about this unwanted behavior, and the pastor believed that that had angered her because he really hadn't heard from her in weeks since that.
Yeah, but you got to set some limits here.
Yeah, he did the right thing, I believe.
Pastor and parishioner.
Exactly. So Shreves said he had turned off his answering machine to avoid getting any messages from Mary Jane, but a detective asked if he'd be willing to turn it on again so they might be able to hear some of her messages. Shreves said he really didn't want to, but he agreed to do it to help them out, and after the two troopers left his house, they agreed that Mary Jane did sound unusual. But at the same time, they really didn't see why Shreves was so rattled by her. And they kind of thought the pastor's reaction to her was strange.
I don't know. You get this woman calling several times a week, leaving messages on your phone, and you come home one day and find that she's been in your house, putting groceries in your fridge. That would bother me.
I think it would bother most people, right? It's weird. So when new people came to the church, it turned out to really create some excitement and curiosity among the parishioners. And this was very true with Rhonda Smith. She was attractive and she didn't fit into the church's older age demographic. So from the morning of that first service, when Rhonda and Dorothy joined the church members for some after-service coffee, Rhonda really fit in with the congregation, especially with Judy. So soon, Rhonda was singing in the choir, spending more time at church, and joining the other women for shopping. But her bipolar disorder was a challenge even during happy times, and soon she was having trouble with her finances again. So Rhonda confided her troubles to Pastor Shreves, who, although he didn't really know her very well, provided her with counseling on a few occasions. The church had an informal network of members who had greater financial means than the others. So it was the pastor who, around Christmas of 2007, decided to reach out to them and see if they could help out Rhonda. So it was maybe a couple of $1,000s in total, but the gifts they gave Rhonda really helped her out. It helped her pay her rent, her electric bill, and her phone bill. And Rhonda was so grateful for the assistance from the church, which had already helped her with many, many things in her life, that she asked the pastor whether she could stand up at the next service and thank the congregation for their generosity. So he agreed to let her do that. And it was during a Sunday morning service in January 2008, just weeks before her death actually, when Rhonda stood up in front of the congregation and thanked them for their moral, spiritual, and financial assistance. So she spoke about her bipolar disorder, how difficult her life could be, and how much she appreciated their understanding and support. She thanked them all, especially the pastor, and she expressed how much better it made her feel to know she had friends who she could count on. So as Judy looked around the church, she saw she wasn't the only one who had been moved to tears by Rhonda. One longtime church member, Paul Rose, was really impressed with Rhonda's courage. He believed Rhonda's life had changed for the better during her time at the church, and he was really happy for her. But among all the happy and emotional reactions in the crowd, one woman sat motionless and staring straight ahead with no reaction on her face. And guess who that was?
That would probably be Mary Jane Fonder.
Mary Jane Fonder, yes. So Pastor Shreves didn't remember when he first met Mary Jane. He had met so many people when he started at the church that most of it was like a blur to him. So there was no reason for him to have thought of Mary Jane any differently than any of the others. But he would become familiar with her in the same way the rest of the congregation was, as an eccentric older woman who could be a bit annoying at times, but seemed otherwise harmless and seemed to have good intentions. So he hadn't gotten to know much about Mary Jane in his first year at the church, but he did know she was a talker, and her physical appearance was notable. The wigs she wore were not attractive, and she did dress poorly for her body frame and her age. But the first time the pastor spoke at length with Mary Jane was the day of the funeral of a parishioner, Sue Bruner's father, and that was in 2006. The service was almost an hour away from the church, so not many people from the church attended, besides the pastor and Judy Zellner. But Mary Jane Fonder was there too, along with her brother Ed, who she was now living with. So during a luncheon after the funeral, the pastor saw Mary Jane and Ed wandering and looking for a table. He knew that the congregation treated Mary Jane civilly, but he also knew she had very few close friends among them, and that she was rarely invited to dinners or social gatherings. Still, he believed that no one could question her love of the church and the community. So the pastor decided to reach out to the Fonders, and he called them over to sit with him. They chatted casually for the next 90 minutes or so, with Mary Jane doing most of the talking. But after a while they started to discuss her artwork. She had a talent for painting and crocheting. So to Pastor Shreves, she just seemed very lonely. Since she was always wanting to do more with the church, he thought of a way to get her more involved. So he asked her if she would like to decorate the bulletin boards. So Mary Jane agreed to this, and soon she was visiting the church 1 or 2 mornings a week. The pastor would let her into the church and help her get started, then leave her unsupervised to do the work. She worked on the bulletin board for several months, but after a while the pastor took over that job himself, because it turned out for all of her artistic abilities, she really made a mess out of the bulletin boards. Still, she did continue coming to the church on weekday mornings and helping out with other small jobs, like updating the calendars or folding the newsletters. And sometimes Shreves would start chatting with her, but really for the most part he tried to avoid her, which I guess is understandable.
Yeah, well, he doesn't want to be trapped into talking with her for an hour, so he's going to make himself scarce.
Yeah, he did. Because once he gave her an opening, she'd just go on and on to the point where it would feel impossible to ever end the conversation.
That's right.
So after that, the two would just speak in passing from time to time. But there was one day in the fall of 2006 where Mary Jane sought out Pastor Shreves for a conversation, and this would forever change things between them. The pastor was working on his laptop computer in his office, and he heard Mary Jane coming up the stairs. But between her age and poor physical fitness, it took her a long time before she got to his door. But he was polite. He invited her in to take a seat in an armchair at the opposite corner of the room. This was the first time Mary Jane had sought him out for a one-on-one conversation like this, and she immediately launched into a long discussion, mostly about herself, focusing on her past, her family, her old home in Philadelphia, and the various jobs she had worked over the years. She showed the pastor old photos of her younger self. That she carried in her wallet, and she described ballet lessons she used to take as a young woman. Now he was getting the impression she just wanted to tell her story, a story maybe very few people had ever taken the time to listen to before. So an hour went by, and still Mary Jane was talking. She talked about how pretty and talented she was when she was young, and about all the things she had wanted to do with her life. She talked about moving to Springfield Township when her parents got sick, and she told him how her life had changed so much after that. So the pastor spent most of his time nodding. He tried to validate what she was saying without offering his own opinions or passing any judgments. But then, out of nowhere, Mary Jane said the words that Shreves would always remember. "You can't deny what's going on between us," she said. And he was completely taken off guard. So the pastor had never noticed Mary Jane showing any kind of romantic interest in him, and his first reaction was to laugh, not trying to be mean-spirited, but just kind of surprised and feeling awkward. But then Mary Jane immediately went back to her conversation, changing the subject as if nothing had happened.
Boy, that's a jaw-dropper, isn't it?
I think it really made him very uncomfortable.
Yeah, you can't deny what's going on between us.
I like
Holy
the
cow.
line, yeah. But, he was a pastor. He couldn't just sit there and listen and not address it. So he said, "Mary Jane, we need to stop. I can't do this anymore." And the conversation ended because Mary Jane just stood up and left the room, not saying another word. But the words seemed to hang in the room even after she had gone. Shreves was shocked, and he tried to think back to whether he had ever given any indication that he was interested in her in that way. but really nothing would come to mind. He thought maybe she got the wrong idea from the way he reached out to her back at the funeral, or from the way he listened to her discussing her past for the last hour. Or maybe it was simply the fact that he was single. Shreves knew some of the women in the church did consider him attractive. But then as he reflected on this, he decided, well, this really had nothing to do with him. It was more about the position that he held. He'd learned about this in past seminars where they referred to it as transference. So Mary Jane probably wasn't interested in him exactly, but in what the office he held represented and its connection to God. But still, this whole thing bothered him.
Yeah, I'd be bothered. Again, you start thinking maybe there's something mentally not right with old Mary Jane.
Well, sure. Well, he did go to the church council to talk about her, but they thought it would just go away and really didn't help. Then, just weeks after that conversation, Mary Jane started calling his house on a more regular basis. So most of the time she called when he wasn't home and left long random messages on his answering machine. She would talk about some random subject for 4 minutes until the message time ran out and the machine cut her off. Then she'd call back and speak for another 4 minutes until it cut her off again. Sometimes she'd call every day for as many as 5 days in a row, and sometimes Shreves would answer and end up talking to her for as long as he could stand it before coming up with an excuse to end the conversation. But, after a while he realized most of the times that she called, it was when she knew or suspected he wouldn't be home, like she really wanted to just leave a voice message.
Yeah, better.
Yeah. So it went on that way for months, and the number of calls fluctuated. One week she might only call once or twice, the next week almost every day. But they did continue into the winter of 2007. So after a while, Pastor Shreves decided to block her number from his phone. But Mary Jane would not be deterred. She started calling from her cell phone instead. Then Pastor Shreves noticed he had extra food in his freezer that he hadn't bought. He usually left his door unlocked, and a few more times after that, more food showed up in his home, or a bag of groceries would be left on his front porch. So at first he didn't make any connection to Mary Jane at all, believing somebody else from the congregation had bought it for him. Then one day when he answered one of Mary Jane's phone calls, she asked him if he needed any more food. So he realized she was coming into his house and leaving groceries for him. He told her to stop bringing food, but Mary Jane persisted, even after the pastor started locking his door. So when she left yet another bag of groceries on his front porch, Shreves decided the only way to make his point was to leave them there. So they sat in front of his house for about a whole week, and the food went bad. After finding out about this, and I don't know how she did, Mary Jane called and left a message for Pastor Shreves, but this time her voice was lower and acrier, almost like that of a completely different person. To Pastor Shreves, it was an almost demonic-sounding voice. And if a pastor says that, he's not fucking around, right?
Yeah, they should know they're demons, right?
Absolutely. Mary Jane said to him, "How can you do this? Ungrateful. Somebody's trying to take care of you and you're snubbing them." So this to the pastor was actually frightening. It had gotten to the point where he didn't feel comfortable even considering himself Mary Jane's pastor.
Yeah, I think if I'm Shreves at this point, I might even consider going to the police and making a complaint.
Absolutely.
At the very least, I would make sure my house was locked. I'd probably buy new locks for the doors and make sure that as best you can that there isn't any way she's going to get in there.
I agree. Well, the situation did finally come to a breaking point one Sunday when Mary Jane called the pastor at around 10:30 at night. So not accustomed to calls at that hour, Shreves worried that it was some sort of an emergency, but it turned out to be Mary Jane just trying to leave another message. So fed up at this point, he yelled into the phone, telling her not to call any more. He suggested she find another church and pastor, too. So at first, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then Mary Jane launched into an angry tirade against him, a lot like she had after he refused to accept her groceries. So when reflecting on the call later, Shreves could not remember exactly what Mary Jane had said, but he remembered her voice. It was that same evil-sounding voice like the last time she became angry, except this time with a touch of restlessness as well. So the calls became slightly less frequent after that, but the pastor was very disturbed. It was like, Mary Jane had revealed a completely different and darker personality. She was different.
I guess.
It was scary.
I'm reminded of the movie The Exorcist.
Right.
Where the little girl, when the demon was speaking through her,
Absolutely.
had that guttural, deep, scary voice.
I'm with you. That's exactly what I was thinking. So detectives went over to Mary Jane's house the day after meeting with Pastor Shreves. Her small ranch home was just 3 miles from the church. After pulling up to the house, they knocked on the door and waited, but nobody answered. There was a car in the driveway, and they saw a light on inside the house, so they knocked again and waited a little while longer, pacing around the front steps and eventually walking around the house, checking to see if anyone was in the backyard or at one of the windows. After about 10 minutes, the front door of the house suddenly opened and Mary Jane's older brother, Ed Fonder, appeared. So Ed was a 69-year-old man of average size with a balding head. He wore glasses and a blank facial expression. The officers explained that they were looking for Mary Jane because they were interviewing members of Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church about Rhonda Smith's death. But Mary Jane was not home now, according to Ed. He explained that unlike his sister, he was not a member of Trinity Evangelical, and he instead attended a different parish. So the officers left a message with him asking Mary Jane to call a detective regarding Rhonda's death. State records would show that Mary Jane owned a .38 caliber Rossi revolver she'd bought in December 1994. On December 28th, 5 days after Rhonda's death, the police received the phone records for the church office. So they were surprised to note that on January 21st, the Monday before Rhonda died, the church had actually received 3 calls from Mary Jane's home. So the first call came in at 11:07 a.m. and it lasted just 6 seconds. The second call was at 11:10 and lasted for 4 minutes and 22 seconds. The third call was at 11:25 and it ran for 2 minutes and 37 seconds. Ballistics experts studied 2 bullets, one in the church office ceiling and one that had to be removed from Rhonda's brain. The bullets were of the .38 .357 caliber class, and they could have been discharged from several makes of revolvers, but that included a Rossi, which is what Mary Jane had. So the state police got Rhonda's autopsy report during the first week of the investigation. The medical examiner recorded 2 gunshot wounds to Rhonda's head. So the first was on her forehead, starting several inches above her eyes, just right of center and ending at her hairline. So that bullet had traveled upward along Rhonda's forehead, splitting the skin and just grazing the front of her skull. So that wound was not fatal. But the second one was. It was just above her right ear, entering her skull with no exit wound. A copper jacket and lead projectile found in the lower left of Rhonda's brain meant the bullet took a front to back and slightly left path. So there was no soot on Rhonda's skin that would have been consistent with a gun being pressed to her skin. Stippling or small round gunpowder marks on Rhonda's right hand and the right side of her face indicated that Rhonda was shot at an intermediate range, between 3 and 4 feet away. So Rhonda's cause of death was ruled to be a gunshot wound to the head, but the manner of death was left as undetermined, which I find surprising. To me, it's obviously a homicide. But law enforcement did remain split in their opinions about this shooting. With Rhonda's history of depression, some still believed that it could have been a suicide. They brought up Rhonda's previous attempts to kill herself, especially that trip to the gun range. One investigator pointed to statements her father Jim Smith had made to the media, saying his daughter would never commit suicide because she knew she would go to hell if she did, and this made some wonder whether he was some kind of a religious nut. It was pointed out that the Smiths had admitted they drove past the church the day Rhonda was killed, so what if, as some troopers had speculated early on, they had found her body and, determined to protect their daughter's reputation from the stigma of suicide, removed the gun from the scene. But those leaning toward homicide pointed out that Rhonda had not one, but 2 gunshot wounds. The stippling noted in the autopsy report suggested that Rhonda was shot from 3 or 4 feet, but that didn't convince all of the investigators either. While the forensic pathologist had worked on many suspicious deaths in Lehigh County, the ME was unknown to many in Bucks County. Some didn't know whether to trust the autopsy findings. Those supporting homicide went through the list of possible suspects. The boyfriends all had alibis, and an investigation into the strange man who had shown up at the church a few times led them nowhere. The investigators brought up Mary Jane Fonder, a parishioner who was bothering the pastor. So this name sparked a memory in the mind of Mark Laudenschlager, the Springfield Township Police Department chief. So Laudenschlager remembered that Mary Jane's elderly father, Edward Fonder, had gone missing back in 1993, while Laudenschlager was still a patrolman. Fonder was never found and was presumed dead. Back in 1993, Mary Jane had been the prime suspect in his disappearance. Even with this new information about Mary Jane, though, the police agreed to keep investigating the Rhonda Smith case, both as a possible homicide and a possible suicide. It was just a few days after Rhonda's death when Mary Jane called her longtime friend Rosalie to say she was heading to Quakertown to go to the laundromat there. Rosalie said she had planned to go to Quakertown that day too, to pick up some things at the grocery store. So the 2 women decided to go into town together and made a day of it by stopping for lunch while Mary Jane's clothes were drying. So over lunch, Rosalie asked about the murder at Mary Jane's church. The church was only a couple of miles away from her home, and it was hard for Rosalie to even imagine that a murder had happened in her township. But Mary Jane said that the police didn't know if it really was a murder. Maybe it was a suicide. With the question of whether Rhonda's death was a homicide or a suicide still out there, the police decided the best way to get to the bottom of it was to go ahead and talk some more to Jim and Dorothy, Rhonda's parents. The theory that Jim found Rhonda's body and cleaned up the scene so it wouldn't look like a suicide was not unprecedented, but it was a long shot. So it was about a week after the murder when Jim and Dorothy once again answered all of their questions. They recalled the details of that horrible day that they lost their daughter, the phone call, their trip to the hospital, and when they were told that their daughter was brain dead. They also reconfirmed that they drove by the church that morning, but that they had not stopped there. Detectives left the house convinced that Jim and Dorothy were loving parents who had nothing to do with covering up Rhonda's suicide. Afterward, police ran a check on guns owned by Jim Smith and were able to confirm what Jim had told them was true. The only handgun registered to him was now owned by his nephew who lived in Vermont, just as Jim had said in an earlier interview. Later, authorities in Vermont checked out that gun, and it didn't match the one that had killed Rhonda. So the Smiths were completely innocent, and Rhonda Smith's death was not a suicide. Now they were convinced it was a murder. Looking more into Mary Jane's background, investigators learned through unemployment records that she had been fired from a Denny's restaurant back in 1994 for threatening a coworker. Her unemployment hearing in the case was on December 13, 1994, a date that really stood out. It was the same date Mary Jane had bought her gun. The officers were able to track down several of Mary Jane's former co-workers from Denny's, and they remembered her as a strange woman who took a lot of medication. They also remembered that Mary Jane would often complain about how mean her father was to her, but they also thought she seemed very upset when he did go missing. So next, They interviewed Diane Anderson, who'd been the Denny's general manager at the time. One day she'd come in and she'd be perfectly fine, Diane said, and the next time she'd just be a crazy woman. It was really like a switch you could click on and off. Mary Jane was strange right from the beginning, she remembered. Sometimes she would show up to work with her wig on backwards and just look really ridiculous. Having previously worked at a salon, Diane repeatedly offered to style her wigs so Mary Jane could tell the front from the back and wear them correctly. But Mary Jane always refused and continued coming to work with her wigs on backward, so it was just really weird. Despite her oddness, though, Diane had liked Mary Jane at first. She'd felt bad for her because she always complained that she needed money and that she had a hard time taking care of her aging father. But after Mary Jane's father disappeared, she got weirder, almost to a scary degree. When Diane made a special lasagna and served it as part of the Denny's menu, a furious Mary Jane stormed into Diane's office, screaming that lasagna was her recipe and that Diane had stole it. So Mary Jane even threatened to kill her. Mary Jane's erratic behavior continued, as did threats against Diane's life. And eventually Diane called Mary Jane into the restaurant's back office and, with another manager present for protection, told Mary Jane they were firing her. So as they'd expected, Mary Jane freaked out, again threatening to shoot Diane with a gun and kill her. Diane and the other manager followed Mary Jane out to make sure she left the restaurant. And as they walked through the dining area, Mary Jane continued yelling and screaming in front of the customers. After the unemployment hearing, when the board ruled against Mary Jane and denied her unemployment compensation, she really seemed to snap, lashing out at everybody in the room. So she even made a crazy accusation that all the men on the board were Diane's boyfriends, and that was the only reason they were siding with her. So although Mary Jane had gotten a gun earlier that day, she left it in the car and did not attempt to bring it into the courtroom. And Diane never saw the weapon and had no idea that Mary Jane had had a gun until after the police spoke with her. So the state police continued to interview as many church members as they could. The more they talked to, the more often Mary Jane Fonder came up. So Sue Bruner, Mary Jane's neighbor, talked about a conversation she had with Mary Jane just 2 days before Rhonda died. Sue was out walking her dog when Mary Jane passed her in her car and stopped. She said, "I've decided I'm not going to come to choir anymore. I'm just too upset about things and I can't do it." So Mary Jane also sometimes filled Sue's answering machine with messages all about the bad vibes she was feeling. Mary Jane told her with disgust about how Rhonda had stood up in front of the congregation to thank the church members for helping her financially. The police also interviewed Mary Brunner, another Trinity parishioner. Mary Jane had told Mary Brunner to stay away from Pastor Shreves. Mary didn't remember that exactly, but she did say that Mary Jane had been acting a bit odder than usual, especially in regard to the pastor. Now, normally Mary Jane seemed to really like the pastor, but in January of 2008, she claimed she wanted nothing more to do with him, so something had certainly bothered her. Mary would also recall a conversation she had with Mary Jane just a few days before Rhonda died. Mary Jane would sometimes stop in her driveway to chat if she was driving by, and she'd done this on the Saturday morning of January 19th. Mary Jane told Mary she was feeling very depressed and had a bad feeling about the church choir. She made references to experiencing bad vibes and bad spirits. Mary Jane also mentioned that Rhonda Smith was in choir now, and she had been at the last practice. So Mary Jane told Mary Brunner she did not plan to go to choir practice for a while.
So there's more people that are talking about the general weirdness of Mary Jane.
Yes, it seems to be pretty unanimous.
So that's helping the detectives in terms of making up their mind.
I guess so, yeah. I mean, the things they're saying are a little strange, and they're in relation to Rhonda and the pastor.
Yeah, more than a little strange.
Yeah. So now detectives were desperate to interview Mary Jane.
Oh, I'll bet they are.
The stories about her odd behavior were just piling up, so they also needed to find out more about her gun. To their happy surprise, she was the first choir member to arrive for practice when they waited for her one evening at the church. so they recognized the short, heavy-set woman from her driver's license photo. She had almost a big, goofy grin on her face. There was a large pair of wide-rimmed glasses balancing on her nose, and she had a large brown wig that looked like it was just kind of sitting on top of her head. But she was just starting to talk immediately as she saw them. "You know, I've been meaning to call you guys. I've been meaning to. I knew you were at the house. I've been meaning to call. I was hoping I'd run into you at the church." So the detectives were taken aback like, whoa. Before even introducing herself, she was already talking a mile a minute and making excuses.
Yeah, she got right into it.
She did. She right away went into explaining that she had called the church Monday looking for the new church directory and had been surprised when Rhonda answered the phone. Rhonda told her, she said, that she was filling in as secretary at the church office while Pastor Shreves was away at a conference. So they talked for about 10 minutes. Mary Jane said that Rhonda took down a message for the pastor to let him know that she had called. But they also talked about how Mary Jane was not getting along with her brother and said she was tired of living with him. Mary Jane told the detectives this, and she claimed that Rhonda told her about an apartment next to hers that was available. So the next day, Mary Jane said, she went to check out the apartment. While on her way there, she drove past the church in the morning and saw Rhonda's car in the parking lot. There weren't any other cars in the parking lot, but nothing seemed unusual to her. Mary Jane explained that on the day Rhonda was shot, she had left her house at 5 minutes to 11 for an 11:30 appointment at Holiday Hair in Quakertown. Her brother was home and saw her leave, she said, and after her hair appointment, she went shopping at Joann Fabrics in the same plaza, and she was home by 3. So it did kind of strike them as suspicious that Mary Jane would say these times so precisely before they even asked her about it. They did continue asking her some questions, and they brought up that records showed she did own a gun. When asked where it was, she said she had thrown it away a long time ago, like years ago. She said she'd thrown it out of her car along the road or into the woods. Now, they had never heard of anyone just throwing a gun away like that, and they didn't believe her. Asked if she hadn't been concerned that someone might find that gun, like a child, she said, well, I actually threw it into a lake somewhere. Then she went on to get more specific and said she threw it in Lake Nakamixon, somewhere in the deep end down by the boat docks. She claimed she got rid of the gun because she'd been having problems with a woman at the Denny's where she used to work. So Mary Jane claimed she was so nervous that police would find this gun and believed she wanted to hurt Diane that she threw it away that same day. She had fired the gun just once, she said.
Yeah, I think she said that just to be sure that if they did find the gun, she had a reason for it being fired.
Exactly. I think you're right. So tell us a little bit about that article that came out after her father disappeared.
Well, the Philadelphia Inquirer published an article that made her look like a suspect in their father's disappearance. She said that upset her, and she was so depressed that she was contemplating suicide. So to test the gun, she had fired it into her yard, but its loud sound had scared her. Now, the police still didn't believe Mary Jane's explanation about where the gun was. They thought she still had it, but they doubted she would admit the truth. And by then, Mary Jane was already off on another topic. She started to tell them about how, on the Sunday before Rhonda died, she had stood up in front of the congregation to thank the group for the financial assistance they had provided her. Now, Mary Jane sounded annoyed by this. Now it's 7 o'clock, and choir is starting downstairs. Mary Jane should have returned to the group because they're getting ready to start practice. But she had an audience upstairs, so she was in no real rush to stop talking. She continued talking as they walked her to the door.
Yeah, in fact, Mary Jane talked for so long that it was too late to interview any of the other choir members. But the police were encouraged by what they had gotten from her so far. She had mentioned the time of 5 minutes to 11, the exact time they believed Rhonda was shot. And Mary Jane confessed she knew Rhonda was working at the church that week. Only 2 other people had known that, Pastor Shreves and the church council president. Then there was her out-of-nowhere mention of how the church had assisted Rhonda, and Mary Jane seemed really jealous about this. So they couldn't believe Mary Jane's story about the gun. It all added up to convince them now that Mary Jane Fonder really had killed Rhonda Smith. So when Mary Jane professed her innocence, her voice completely changed into a slower, low-pitched, angry voice. It was a voice that investigators hadn't previously heard in all the hours they had spoken to Mary Jane. And to them it was also a voice that seemed just plain evil. Mary Jane's sweet old lady facade had been cracked, revealing something else hidden underneath. And this was probably the Mary Jane that poor Rhonda had seen right before Mary Jane killed her. So, while the two detectives were interviewing Mary Jane at the church, there were two state troopers who went to her house to talk to her brother alone. Ed Fonder answered the door, and although both men had seen some filthy homes during their time in law enforcement, they would describe the Fonder house as revolting. So the place was a real mess, with piles of papers stacked from the floor almost to the ceiling. In the living room there were plastic jugs half filled with water in one corner of the room that were covered with cobwebs all the way up to the ceiling. There were also boxes of assorted junk covering nearly every part of the floor. And where you could see the carpet, it was so worn that you could also see the plywood underneath it. Other parts of the floor were just disgusting, covered with birdseed and animal feces. So Ed, though, was polite. He said he didn't believe his sister had anything to do with their father's disappearance. But he did say that Mary Jane had been upset lately. He said she'd been too upset to go to Rhonda's funeral, so Ed had gone in her place. At the luncheon after the funeral, Ed said he picked up some pamphlets about dealing with grief, and he gave them to Mary Jane. And Mary Jane had said to him that the information in the pamphlets reflected exactly what she was going through after Rhonda's death. She said she was feeling depressed and really stressed out, and had started having nightmares. Then Ed ended the interview. He told the troopers, though, that he would be willing to answer any questions they might have in the future, and he said he would let Mary Jane know that they had stopped by. The day after speaking to Mary Jane at the church, the detective's first stop was the holiday hair salon that Mary Jane said she had been to the day Rhonda died. So the salon was able to give them the customer sign-in sheet for January 23rd, and Mary Jane's name was on the sheet, with a sign-in time of 11:22 a.m. The officers were unable to talk to the stylist who did Mary Jane's hair, though, that day, because she wasn't scheduled to work.
The officers also drove two different routes from Mary Jane's house to the salon to determine whether Mary Jane would have had enough time to leave her house, stop at the church, and get to the salon within the time frame that Rhonda had been shot. During their first trip, they traveled from her house to the salon, which is a 10.2-mile route that took about 17 minutes to drive. On a second route, they first drove from Mary Jane's house to the church, which was 3.2 miles, and took about 5 minutes. Then driving from the church to the salon was another 8 miles and took 14 minutes. Now, if Rhonda was shot just after 10:54 a.m., as police suspected, because that's when her internet activity had abruptly stopped, then Mary Jane would have had enough time to get from the church to the salon by 11:22.
Well, yeah, really plenty of time. So a few days later, they spoke with Mary Jane's hairstylist. She knew Mary Jane as a regular customer, though she hadn't come by for an appointment for a long time prior to January 23rd. That day she saw Mary Jane pull into the shopping center parking lot and park her car in the handicapped parking spot in front of the salon. Mary Jane had not made an appointment that day, but she did sign in on the walk-in sheet. When she took Mary Jane for her hair styling, Mary Jane followed her normal routine of taking off the wig she was wearing to have her own hair washed and styled. Mary Jane wasn't acting differently that day, but she did mutter to herself while her hair was drying. Still, that was not abnormal for Mary Jane. She was talking a little louder than usual, but the stylist could not hear what she was saying. After Mary Jane left, she'd forgotten and left her wig behind, so that was unusual. The wig was easy to find under the front counter, but the police did not take it because they didn't have a search warrant. They did contact the DA to get a warrant quickly. They thought the wig would give them enough cause to search Mary Jane's house for her gun, and if they could find that, the case would be closed. So the wig was picked up and put into evidence the next day, and 2 elements found in gunpowder residue were found on the wig, but not a third element that's required for it to be a definite match. So during one meeting with the pastor in early February, when the subject of Mary Jane came up, a detective leaned in and said to the pastor, "We know a lot about Mary Jane Fonder." So Pastor Shreves would never forget those words because in that moment he put it all together. The police did believe that Mary Jane had killed Rhonda. Strangely, this brought Shreves some peace. Of course, the idea of going to church every week with a murderer did frighten him, but at least now he had some idea what to watch out for and wasn't suspicious of the whole world as he had been for a while. That Mary Jane was the killer had never even crossed his mind, but after he heard that, it suddenly made sense. All the phone messages she'd left for him, the confession of her romantic feelings for him, that gave her a motive. So the lake was searched, but no gun was recovered until a fisherman found it.
It was a miracle. The police had searched for the gun in the lake and just couldn't find it. And then the fisherman, sometime in April, kind of on the shore of the lake, there was a gun. So that was enough cause for the police to arrest Mary Jane for Rhonda's murder.
Well, yeah, they could tell by the gun that it hadn't been in there for 14 years, for one thing.
No, couldn't have been.
No, so they arrested her for Rhonda's murder. During police questioning, she'd admitted to purchasing a .38, and she claimed to have thrown it into Lake Nakamixon in 1994.
Yeah, well, the gun was in too good shape to be thrown in 14 years previously. So the idea from the police's standpoint is that Mary Jane still had the gun, and once she learned that she might be a suspect, she decided to get rid of the gun.
Well, plus she'd used the gun to kill Rhonda. Forensic testing proved that the recovered gun and ammunition had been put in the lake more recently, and the gun found was registered to Mary Jane, and they knew it had been used to kill Rhonda Smith. So the pastor avoided most of the media's questions that were directed at him, but he did speak to the Philadelphia Inquirer and express disbelief at Mary Jane's arrest. But of course Pastor Shreves had known for weeks that the police were focusing on Mary Jane, and he had long since been convinced that she was the one who had killed Rhonda. But the media reports following her arrest were particularly painful for the pastor to read. Mary Jane had an attorney named Michael Applebaum, a defense lawyer with a good reputation in the area. He'd worked 4 murder cases before taking Mary Jane on as a client. Mary Jane had contacted Applebaum shortly after a lengthy February 25th interview at the state police barracks. She and her brother Ed met in his office with his associate attorney, who would end up being the second chair for her defense. So following her arrest, Applebaum spoke to the press on her behalf. From what we've determined, she's a good Christian, active in her church, and she hardly knew Rhonda except from the church. Many reporters were asking if Mary Jane suffered from mental illness, and although Applebaum said he did not have enough information to answer that, he was very quick to mention her many physical health problems, which included diabetes, arthritis, and high blood pressure. He tried to paint her as a kindly old woman who loved her church, but said she was not loved in return by the congregants. He even compared their treatment of Mary Jane to the Salem witch trials. He believed they had shunned her.
That's a good defense lawyer's ploy.
Well, yeah, they have to be dramatic.
Yeah, there's nothing that's too much hyperbole.
No, I mean, his job is to defend her.
Yeah, Salem witch trials. Holy cow.
Yeah. Well, it was difficult for Pastor Shreves to see his church portrayed as being insensitive or not compassionate toward Mary Jane. He felt like they were being forced to face a hard truth about themselves. But what bothered Shreves even more than those accusations were Mary Jane's own words. He really hated to read about the feelings Mary Jane apparently had had for him, and he worried about the many ways people would misinterpret his own role in this imaginary love triangle. The idea that somebody could suspect him of having romantic involvement with his congregants whether it be Rhonda or Mary Jane, left him feeling very uncomfortable. But nothing would bother him more than the reports of what Mary Jane told police during her interviews about her fears that Shreves had fallen in love with Rhonda and gotten involved in something he shouldn't have. So as if she was some sort of motherly figure trying to protect him because he had gotten in over his head.
That's good.
So the day after the arrest, Mary Jane was close to the thoughts of anybody at Trinity Evangelical. In a way, her presence was looming over every church member. Choir practice did go ahead as scheduled, but few were really able to concentrate. Most of the women there were still reeling from the shock of this.
Yeah, of course. It's a small town. Murders don't happen very frequently.
Well, not by modest-looking church ladies.
Yeah, 60-something-year-old church lady.
Yeah.
In poor health.
Yep, apparently. So then Ed Fonder went to the police to tell them about something he found in his car that might be considered evidence against his sister. Ed explained he had gotten into the car that morning to go for an oil change, and he saw sunlight reflecting off of a metal object on the floor of the driver's seat. Ed thought it was an earring at first, but after he picked it up and took a closer look, it appeared to be some sort of discharged bullet. So Ed placed the object back where he had found it and immediately called his attorney, who suggested he turn it over to the police. The police asked permission to search Ed's car, and he agreed, and he signed a consent form. The search confirmed Ed's original suspicions. A large bullet fragment was on the driver's side floor, as well as another smaller fragment elsewhere in the car. So when this later became public knowledge, many people were just stunned that Ed Fonder would so willingly cooperate in handing over potentially damning evidence against his sister.
Yeah, I'm not so sure why people should be stunned. Ed is doing what he thinks is the right thing.
Yeah, he was cooperating with the police at every turn.
Yeah, and he still shocked people when he eventually ended up testifying against her in court.
Yeah, but like you said, I guess this had nothing to do with taking sides. He just had this strong sense of morals and was devoutly religious, and for him, it wasn't like he was sided against her. He just believed in telling the truth. So I guess it was as simple as that.
Yeah, it sounds simplistic, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. The police sent specimens from Mary Jane's car to be tested for gunpowder residue, and a specimen from the turn signal handle and the driver's door handle both tested positive. When testing was completed a few weeks later, there was another positive GSR specimen from Mary Jane's driver's seat. So Applebaum had an expert do a psychological evaluation on Mary Jane. The results, which were never publicly released, found that Mary Jane was not mentally ill or legally insane. So although there was some paranoia and a few schizophrenic tendencies, the exam found she was not suffering from any major delusions. So had Applebaum planned to pursue an insanity defense, he certainly could have had another test done. But Mary Jane was insisting she was innocent, and that left the possibility of an insanity defense out altogether.
Yeah, it's tough to argue insanity if the perpetrator is insisting of her innocence.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess so. Mary Jane's trial began on October 21st, 2008, and prosecutors argued that she was jealous of new member Rhonda Smith, who was receiving sympathetic attention and even financial assistance from some of the church's congregants and the pastor. Mary Jane's defense attorney told the court that his client was not present at the scene of the crime and that she did not shoot Rhonda Smith. He also argued that Rhonda's death may have been suicide or a homicide committed by a jealous wife or a lover. During closing arguments, Mary Jane's attorney told the jury that Mary Jane's brother Ed Fonder was a likely suspect, pointing out that he had hired a lawyer after finding the bullet fragments in his car and notifying the police. But the prosecution wanted the jury to hear Mary Jane's jealousy directly from her own mouth. So on the 8th day of the trial, almost 3 hours of her February 25th interview with police was played for the courtroom. Lots of people think maybe my pastor was involved with that lady, Mary Jane said. I wonder if the poor pastor was in love with that lady.
So the recording showed that Mary Jane was forthcoming with police throughout the interview, until they mentioned that her wig was being tested for gunshot residue. Then her voice broke as she asserted her innocence. "I'm sure that nothing appeared in my wig because I don't have a gun and I didn't do anything," she said.
Well, Applebaum knew the interview was going to hurt her in the eyes of the jury, and he believed if she had simply declined to talk to the police, she could have had a not guilty verdict. She had the right, but she simply did not have the ability to remain silent. So after the prosecution rested its case, it was announced the defense wouldn't be presenting a case and that Mary Jane wouldn't testify.
Yeah, I guess Applebaum figured that she would be very damaging to her case if she were to testify.
I know, but think of the entertainment value.
Well, yeah, but she's not there to entertain.
No, I know.
But yeah, I can see her on the stand.
Well, I would just think that the prosecution would be able to get her worked up, right?
Oh, yeah.
And she would show her true self. But Applebaum gave his closing statement first, and this time his closing argument differed from that of his opening statement. So rather than pointing to the possibility of suicide or that one of Rhonda's boyfriends may have committed her murder, he turned the spotlight right on Ed Fonder, claiming he was a much more believable suspect than Mary Jane. He pointed out how suspicious it was that Ed hired a lawyer after finding those bullet fragments. There's just as much evidence against Ed Fonder as there is Mary Jane, Applebaum said. In fact, even more.
Well, except for the fact that they have absolutely no motive for Ed to have done it.
Yeah, that's true.
They got plenty of motive for Mary Jane.
Yes, that's true. And physical evidence. So it was October 30th, after 6 hours of deliberations, when the jury found Mary Jane guilty of first-degree murder and possession of an instrument of crime. On December 5th, she was sentenced to serve life in prison. Now, at her sentencing hearing, she made the following statement. "I did not kill Rhonda Smith. I thought she was a lovely girl. And I certainly wasn't jealous of this woman for any reason. I'm so sorry she's gone, but in the same respect, I will be gone too. I'm the second person in the church to be murdered." Murdered by the system, that is.
Oh.
But after a year, Mary Jane said she was beginning to remember the actions that brought her to prison. She admitted that on January 23, 2008, she had cornered Rhonda in the basement church office, pulled back the hammer of the pistol, and fired 2 bullets into her head. She said she regrets telling everyone, the judge and Rhonda's family, that she was innocent. With time to think in prison, the events that led up to Rhonda's murder are beginning to become clear, she said. But Mary Jane did say that she still didn't remember killing Rhonda Smith. She remembered calling the church 2 days before Rhonda's death, and when she heard Rhonda's voice, she hung up in surprise. She also remembered being jealous that Rhonda was asked to answer the phones instead of her. She still didn't remember going to the church on January 23rd or actually speaking to Rhonda that day. But she suddenly had these memories of going that morning to a small lake and park in nearby Haycock Township, near where the gun was found. Now, as far as the investigation into the disappearance of Mary Jane's father, that remains open and is not solved. Mary Jane is considered the prime suspect in the case, and she was the only suspect who had ever been publicly identified. Because the police can't divert resources from active cases with suspects who are not already incarcerated, the pace of the investigation was very slow. Then, in February of 2010, Mary Jane dropped her appeal of her conviction, and on June 4, 2018, she died of cardiac arrest at the State Correctional Institution Muncie in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania. So now we'll never know what happened to her father.
Yeah, we're not going to pursue that.
Well, no. But there really doesn't seem to be any other explanation. Why haven't they found his body or anything? That's the real mystery.
Picked a good spot.
That's right. Okay, how about a little feedback?
Okay.
It's time for listener feedback.
I got some voicemails for you today.
Love voicemails. So,
The first one's from Anna.
yeah.
And she has a couple case suggestions, although I couldn't find very much information about one of them, so we'll just discuss one of her two suggestions.
All right.
Hi, Jill and Dick. This is Anna from North Dakota. I recently saw a 2020 episode in which you guys were featured, and I immediately went onto my Spotify and started following you guys. Couldn't wait to start listening to you, and now you guys have quickly become my favorite podcast, especially since you guys are 1, into beer, 2, Dick is a pediatrician, and I am a nurse, and 3, you guys are into true crime, which, of course, is potentially my greatest passion. Anyway, while I have really enjoyed listening to your guys' episodes, the one that really resonated with me this morning was listening to the one about Ayla, the little 20-month-old girl. That just breaks my heart, and it reminds me of baby Brianna. That was also a point of discussion in previous years. I just really don't understand how people can treat babies that way. Anyway, I have 2 cases to recommend to you. One is local to my hometown of Sterling, Colorado, and it is regarding Kayla Brown and Samuel Pullman, occurring in March of 2004. Samuel shot Kayla in the face. She was his ex-girlfriend at the time, I guess, and then he also committed suicide. There really has not been much information regarding that case since that time, but Kayla is now dating my estranged brother. So I was very interested to hear about this case and see if you guys could dig up some information on that. A beer that I would recommend is from the local Parts and Labor Brewing in Sterling, and it's called Loose Lips Sink Ships, a vanilla coconut porter. I've never had it, but it sounds delicious. The second one that I would recommend you guys cover is the case of Anita Knutson that occurred in Minot, North Dakota in June of 2007. I have had the hardest time getting any information on this case. I saw one Dateline episode about her that did not really give many answers. I just, when getting ready to leave this voicemail, was researching the woman who was charged with her murder, and she was actually acquitted and found innocent. One of my other favorite podcasts, Midwest Murder, they are local to Minot, North Dakota, and they very quickly shut down their request for them to cover this case. So if there's any information that you guys could find about that case, that would be amazing. A North Dakota beer that is local to Bismarck, which is where I live, is from Laughing Sun Brewery, and it is their Red Dwarf, which is a sour, and it is very delicious. I enjoy having it every time I go there. Thanks again for your guys' input. I really enjoy listening to you guys and can't wait to catch up on all of your episodes as I have started right from the beginning.
Well, thank you, Anna. This is one of maybe a handful of people who found us through 2020, so I guess it was worth the effort to do that.
I still had fun doing it.
It was fun, yeah. It was definitely an experience that we enjoyed. So we're really happy you found us, Anna. So Anita Knutson, what'd you find out, Dickie? Looks like you didn't find a lot either.
Well, I didn't, but I found more about Anita than I did about Sarah Brown.
Okay.
I don't really have, at this point, a lot more information than Anna had.
Okay, well, we can always just put it out there for other listeners who might have info to write into us.
Right.
Yeah.
So she was a student at Minot State University and found stabbed to death in early June 2007.
This is Anita, yeah.
This is Anita. And then 8 years go by, crime is still unsolved. And then the Minot Police Department was under more pressure to find the killer. DNA testing of the murder weapon hadn't been done and finally did get done. And it was not a full DNA profile. But what they could tell from the DNA was that it was a female, or at least not a male. And Anna's roommate, Nicole Price, wasn't excluded by DNA testing. So she was arrested, went on trial in March of this year, and was found not guilty.
Well, that's interesting. Okay, so we'll look more into that. And Sarah Brown. And just a quick mention of Ayla Reynolds. That was one of the first cases we did, maybe in the first 10 that we ever did when we lived in Maine.
Yeah, that was a local case.
Yeah.
Or a fairly local case.
And a real mystery, really. And it looks like we haven't found out much since, huh? Just looking up the Wikipedia here, and it's not solved. We all think the boyfriend did it. The mother has filed civil suits against him.
Yeah, but nothing more than that.
No, nope, nothing's been found. So that's just heartbreaking, though. Who does that? 19 months old. That's the shittiest thing ever. That's just unimaginable, isn't it?
Oh, it is.
Heartbreaking. So this guy was just a real piece of human trash, I guess. Not a great person, but at all. What a horrible person. And it is heartbreaking for the mother. These were people with very limited means, young people, right? So they already had their difficulties, and apparently the father of Ayla was just horrible, abusive.
He was.
Okay, well, thanks, Anna, and maybe we'll hear some more about those cases you brought up. And I definitely will try Red Dwarf because sours are my favorite. I love them.
I will be on the lookout for it.
Okay, so the next voicemail is from?
The next one's from Louise.
Okay.
And she's got a fascinating case.
All right, let's hear it.
Hi, Jill and Dick. I just thought of this one because she's only just been found guilty. Erin Patterson, the mushroom murderer, she has been all over our media for the last, I don't even know how long it's been, but, this is Louise from Brisbane, recent member. She was found guilty like a couple of days ago. She basically cooked some beef Wellington with death cap mushrooms and served them up to her in-laws' family and killed 3 of them and made a 4th one really sick. That might be an interesting one for you if you get some time. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Louise. Actually, I have seen some information on this case. It's been pretty big in the news and on YouTube. I've noticed a lot about it. So I would love to cover that. Any kind of poisoning is usually fascinating, especially if it's a domestic situation like that. So yeah, there's a lot of information on YouTube, lots of stuff that we can use, and I think we'll go ahead and cover that case soon.
Yeah, we should.
There's plenty of information out there on it. So thank you, Louise. I love how excited you were about it, that you even forgot to say your name at first. That's a real true crime person that can get that excited.
Yeah, she killed her in-laws and another relative by marriage. And the husband of that couple survived. Her estranged husband was supposed to be present for the meal also. But he begged off and said he couldn't do it. So good for him.
I guess he got lucky there, yeah. But yeah, it was definitely planned out.
Yeah.
She knew where to get them and everything.
So it was July 7th.
Yeah, it was very recent.
She was found guilty on all counts, and sentencing is somewhere down the road.
Yeah, very famous case right now. Okay, thanks, Louise. And we have a voicemail from Eileen. I just have to thank you guys for these voicemails. If we could get 4 voicemails every week, I would love it, because I would play them. So just keep that in mind. Eileen, let's hear what she has to say.
Hi, Jill and Dick. This is Eileen. I'm calling from Tucson, Arizona, about a very fascinating case that began in 2012. It involved a little 6-year-old girl in Tucson called Isabel Celis. She was taken from her bed in the middle of the night, despite there being dogs in the house and the rest of the family sleeping nearby. She was missing for 5 years when a suspect became on the police radar, and he also eventually was linked to another murdered child. Immediately after missing, finger pointing began, and the father was the prime suspect for quite some time. The public became very involved, and they had ceremonies with lots of purple balloons and everybody praying for Isabel's safe return. Unfortunately, that was not to happen, and the gentleman who did take her has been arrested finally and is now serving time. Thank you very much. I enjoy your podcast, and I don't drink alcohol, so I don't really have a beer recommendation, but I'm sure you'll figure out something. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Eileen. Yeah, these cases about children are always tough. There's actually a big segment of our listeners that just hate it when we cover a case with a child. And then there's another segment where it's kind of their favorite, not in a horrible, mean-spirited way, but just because of, you know, your history as a pediatrician and the discussions that can happen with that. But this was definitely a tragic case and quite a mystery how she was able to be abducted.
Yeah, especially with dogs in the house.
I know. I always count on our dogs.
So
I always feel safe.
That's why he was a suspect, or at least a person of interest.
The father?
The father.
Yeah. Clearly.
The guy who did do it, and I'll have to look more into this, but apparently he had some sort of brain cramp because he told authorities he would tell them where Isabel's body could be found if they would drop burglary charges against him.
Oh.
So I guess certainly because he knew where the remains were, he was a suspect.
Absolutely. I could see that.
So he went on trial in 2023. That ended up with a hung jury. The retrial last year, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. And Eileen mentioned that he was liable to another murder. This is a separate trial. He was found guilty in the murder of a 13-year-old named Maribel Gonzalez in 2014.
So, just a real scumbag.
He sounds like it.
Yeah. Well, we can always find beers in Tucson, that's for sure, Eileen. They have some great breweries there that we visit because it's really not that far from us.
Yeah.
And we have family in the area, so that will be easy for us to do.
Sure will.
Yeah, so thank you, Eileen. Then we have one more voicemail from Claire.
This is from Claire.
All righty.
Hi, hello from the UK. My name's Claire. I live in the north of England in a little town called Wetherby, which is in Yorkshire. And I absolutely love your podcast. I've been listening to it for, ages and ages. And I love the way that you combine crime with a bit of medical stuff. I'm a midwife, so a lot of what you're talking about, I'm like, yes, that's right. That does not make sense. But I have something that I would like you to look into, and also a beer recommendation from brewery in that same city. So very close to where I live, a woman called Claudia Lawrence went missing not long after my first daughter was born. So it's about, almost 20 years ago now. She was basically walking to work one day and disappeared. There's loads of podcasts, loads of theories about it, but I would really love your take on it. And whilst you're at it, if you fancy trying a beer called Get Baked, it's the world famous chocolate cake stout. It's a dark beer, lots of chocolate, cocoa, vanilla, and very tasty. You can only have one though, very strong as well. That is also brewed in the same city. So would love to hear your take on what might have happened to Claudia. Sadly, her dad, Peter, died not too long ago, but her mum is still alive and still very much hoping for any information about what happened to her daughter. All very mysterious. There's lots of Wetherby is also implicated because there is some suggestion that she was seen trying to get help on a very busy road. We're at a motorway close to where we are. But yeah, keep doing what you're doing. Love the podcasts. Keep going.
Well, thank you, Claire. What a beautiful accent, I have to say. So we do like to look at some of these unsolved cases more because we really haven't covered that many of them. So I definitely would like to look into this. Did you find anything out about it, Dickie, or pretty much gave us the story?
That's this basic story.
Yeah.
One thing I did read was that the investigators did a little bit of victim abuse. I guess Claudia Lawrence had a fairly active social life.
Oh, victim blaming.
And so she was, victim blaming is exactly it. There's a lot of suspects that have been looked at. One of those suspects is a serial killer named Christopher Hallowell. But like we've said, nobody's been charged at this point. So I think it'd be an interesting thing to look into.
Yeah, definitely. And this beer, Get Baked, sounds good. Have you heard of it?
I haven't.
It's new to you. All right. So let's look into that because we love a chocolate stout.
Yeah, it might be difficult getting it. We'll look.
I have faith in you. I know you can do it. So another thing just I wanted to say before we end feedback for the day is this James Craig trial we've been following. The dentist who murdered his wife with poison.
Accused of.
Yeah, he's not convicted yet. I believe he will be, but just such a fascinating case about how he was able to get a hold of these 3 different poisons, the text that he had sending the girlfriend and the wife, and it's really crazy. It's one of the craziest cases I've ever heard, and that's saying something, because we've heard some crazy cases.
Yes, we have.
I love it because it is not being televised, but there is an attorney on YouTube, Lawyer Lee, who we love to watch, and she does an update on the case Monday through Friday every day and is able to go online and actually see the trial. So she can kind of give us a secondhand experience on that trial. So that's something, if you're looking for something to follow that's a current case, I would recommend it. I think it's a really interesting case. And I guess that'll be it for today, huh?
I think
we've done enough for today.
we've done enough damage.
Okay. Well, we are so appreciative for all of you being here and listening to us today. We hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll see you soon at the quiet end.
Come on down. We got plenty of room.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.